Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. As you know, this year we continue focusing on sustainability in scholarly publishing, including the humanities and beyond. And today, the question of underrepresentation of Global South scholars in major English language international journals. Stay with us. Global academia is a world divided. Top-ranked journals, which are overwhelmingly based in the global north, feature a disproportionately small number of authors with Global South citizenship and location. Articles in Global South-themed issues garner fewer citations than other articles. Above all, scholarship from the United States superdominates, and this is reflected in the editorial boards which reproduce themselves through recruitment of new members already known to existing leadership. The absence of Global South voices impoverishes the whole, with Global North academia suffering from the insularity and blind spots engendered by repeated self-reference and self-regard. Efforts to address underrepresentation of the global majority quickly get stuck in the pincer of calls on the one hand for meritocracy, not diversity, and on the other hand, from a lack of merit from the very few submissions originating in the Global South. What is to be done? All of the above is set out in the article Democratizing Publishing in Communication Media Studies, a case study of communication, culture, and critique, published this February in the journal Online Media and Global Communication by de Gruyter Brill. And its authors, Drs. Eve Ng and Melissa Click, are with us today to help us make sense of all of it. Dr. Ng and Click, welcome to Sustainability Matters.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Wow, I just have to say, what an article. There's so much in here. And, normally we start with really focused questions and then steadily broaden things out and zoom out as the conversation develops. But we're living in such an unusual moment. It's hard to avoid thinking about the bigger picture from the very beginning. Everywhere one looks, diversity, multiculturalism, pluralism, all of these interlocking phenomena are under attack. Absolutism, totalitarianism, and homogeneity are really on the march. So I wanted to start us off with some big questions about first principles. I don't want to pack too much in at the beginning, but why does diversity matter? And why does diversity in academia specifically matter?
Yeah, well, of course, those are great questions, and I'm glad you started with them. I think your recap captures a lot of the answers already, right? So we can think of it in terms of an issue of equity, that it's an issue of justice, of social justice, if we're looking more broadly, not just in academia, but if we're looking at the world and who constitutes the populations in any particular place. As you already sort of summarized, certain groups have historically and still now dominate in a way disproportionate to their numbers, right? So if we come down to academia and we look at the divide that we were focused on in this article, Global North versus Global South, then Global North scholars are highly disproportionately misrepresented. And within the Global North, obviously certain countries like the US and some European countries, but the sort of US centricity, particularly in, as you mentioned, the top journals, the top ranked journals, is glaring, right? So just in terms of equity, in terms of who should be participating, who should be visible in our fields in different areas, that's an important and sort of central point. Now, as you also mentioned, diversity is fraught because way before this current administration in the US, arguments have been made say, oh, if you're just sort of being diverse for diversity's sake, you're sacrificing something, and usually it's been cast in terms of merit, or the people who are doing the best are getting rewarded, and saying, instead you're sort of, counting numbers. It's sort of a tokenism, right? I think that in academia, people anticipate that critique and therefore frame it in terms of, well, our field would be much richer if we could get a much broader cross-section of scholarship, right? The theories would be, reflect different positionalities. Our data would be richer. The theoretical complexity of different subfields would improve. And so this is good for us, right? This is good for communication media studies to have this diversity. But those two arguments can't really be separated, although sometimes they are. And I think that if we drill down and think, okay, take one or take the other, and are there issues with one or the other arguments? I think you can find some problems, and that, I think, anticipates your next your next question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about those kinds of arguments, because there is this tendency to appeal to the self-interest of one's audience when making arguments, which is a rhetorical tactic so deeply embedded in the culture. But I wonder if such a pragmatist approach, especially with regards to questions of diversity, focusing on the self-interest of audiences, would risk backfiring by suggesting, for example, in this case, that the global north has no ethical responsibility for diversity and inclusion apart from unvarnished selfishness. Is there space to insert ethical arguments into the debate?
Absolutely. I mean, the argument definitely has a chance of backfiring. Most arguments do. But our journal is a particularly interesting space because it is an official publication of the International Communication Association. So it's automatically supposed to be representing an international group of scholars. It doesn't always do that. It fails a lot. And our journal has a scope that involves critical scholarship. So approaching questions of power, inequality, and justice, and putting those at the center of empirical and theoretical inquiry. And when we do that, our argument is bigger than, self-interest. So we always approached the editorial decisions we made from a position of critical scholarship, working to be self-reflexive about failures of past and present. Our article that we've written about our experience is, of course, another self-reflexive moment of looking to see how we did and how our experience might help other people in the future. We wanted to make real change beyond self-interest of the global north. We wanted to move the conversation forward in terms of addressing equity from the center point of our organization and our scholarship. And in retrospect, we didn't always make the most effective choices, but we remain really committed to the goals that were behind the practices that we did undertake.
I want to get into that a little bit more, but where things went well and where things didn't go well, and what we can learn collectively from your experience and the awesome transparency, unusual transparency that your article provides. But thinking about the bigger picture, it crosses my mind. I wonder what you think about how much of the current backlash we're seeing against diversity generally is being driven by the fact that the global south is in fact rising on its own terms.
Yeah, actually, Melissa and I had a conversation about this a few days ago because we're thinking, if we look at the timing, is that how it went? Sort of a increased visibility of global south scholarship and then the backlash. But we feel like this is a very old pattern of any time there's a increase in visibility or voices speaking out from traditionally marginalized groups, there's a risk of backlash, right? So, and this can happen for my own sort of specialty. It's looking at, for example, LGBTQ representation. So some increase and then mainstream backlash say, why are there gay characters in every show, being shoved down our throats, right? more recently, trans media representation, but also political visibility and a fight for political rights. And we see that backlash very clearly, not just in the sort of media representation domain, but in the political realm as well. But when we're thinking about this sort of academia, I wouldn't even say it's a pushback against global south or making more space for the global south, but more in the global north, just a pushback against, as you were intimating, gender diversity, racial diversity, and inclusion, right? It doesn't even have to be like making it more diverse. Just any kind of inclusion is now cast as problematic. And that, I'm not sure, is a response so much to global south rising, as you mentioned, but global north anxieties, and I mean by the sort of traditionally dominant groups, white traditional majority, but now threatened not to be majority populations. And that has manifested in the US, at least, as a pushback against both domestic diversity and this kind of xenophobic, like, we don't want any of this other stuff from like foreign countries in the political realm. But in terms of, CCC, Communication, Culture and Critique, is a journal of the International Communication Association, ICA. IA itself has addressed a need for greater global diversity in a few different ways. And I'm going to ask Melissa to speak to this because I think she has been more attuned to it.
Well, many of us who were on the editorial team served in board member roles at ICA. And when we come together as an ICA board, one of the things we talk about is whether the organization is living up to its international name. And some of the things we've seen the organization do in the past, I would say, decade, is to develop regional conferences. A lot of times our conference will be in the North America, US, Canada, sometimes Mexico area, and then it will be in another year somewhere else. And that travel is expensive for people. Certainly in the current moment, we're seeing travel restricted. So not everyone will be able to participate at the official conference every year. So ICA developed regional conferences that perhaps will be on the African continent or will be in South Asia to allow scholars to gather in different places and to allow scholars who can't always afford to or get access to travel to the official conference locations to still gather and reap the benefits of all of the reasons why we go to academic conferences in the first place. We hear a lot of talking about internationalizing our international organization. And so, we sort of came in with that mindset that that's what we want to come in and do. That's what we hear our organization telling us to do. And we didn't see the journal doing it. In fact, the other journals also not doing it. And we wanted to try.
Fantastic. So to make clear to our audience, the article is a case study of your 4-year terms as associate editor and editor-in-chief of the journal Communication, Culture, and Critique, which itself has a mission to place, quote, questions of power, inequality, and justice at the center of empirical and theoretical inquiry, end quote. After the introductions, the first section of the article takes on the problem of underrepresentation of scholars from the global south on the editorial boards of major English language international journals. And in the article, you locate the source of this in journals generally not holding open calls or electing their editorial boards, but rather inviting short lists of scholars who they already know to join the board. And forgive me for, I don't know how ignorant my question is because I'm personally unfamiliar with these kinds of workings. But the remedy which you implemented was to make a very long list of potential scholars known not necessarily just to the editorial board, but to the editorial board and people known to the editorial board. So you cast a wider net, but you used the same technique. So I guess my first question is, why did you not hold an open call or elections to the board?
An excellent question, and one that we asked ourselves in retrospect. So by way of explaining that, I'll say that I had never been an editor or an associate editor of a journal before I was selected to become the editor-in-chief. And I didn't receive a lot of training on how things worked. The training that I got was from the publisher about how to move articles through the system, which of course I needed to know. And I don't know what other editors' experiences are like, but no one ever sat me down and said, well, here's an editorial board and here's how it functions and here's what you should be thinking about. Or, we're changing the way ICA does X, Y, or Z, and we want you to do it this way. There is no training. So a lot of the time, and remember that editorial work is very minimally paid, if paid at all. Whether you're on the board, you're an associate editor or the editor-in-chief. And I'll also just say COVID hit right as I was being appointed editor. So perhaps any conversation I might have normally had about how editorial boards work or what my role was as an editor was really limited to our team. I had a fantastic team. I loved working with the associate editors. So all of this is to say, it took us a long time to understand how things worked. You get tossed in and there's the immediate, you need this many reviewers, the issue's going to press on this date. And there's not a lot of time for that higher order thinking about how things work or how they should work. So we did our best. We discussed a lot how we wanted to proceed, and we proceeded in ways that made sense for us at the time. We knew that, me just coming up with a list of all my good pals that I wanted to put on the editorial board was not a good way to proceed and wasn't what we wanted to do. But we didn't have any models. There were no articles like the one we just published that we could have read or that we were aware of that would help us understand that. And so it was right at the end of our editorial term where we got an inquiry from a scholar who had put together a special issue for the journal. And they said, how do you get on the editorial board? And could you please put me on it? And it was then, and as Eve and I were writing, we just thought, oh my gosh, here's another, it's obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't obvious at the time, right? So we put that into the article because we wanted other editors to think about that. And we, at times have looked at other journals' editorial board lists and seen like the repetition of the same universities in the members' bios. And we knew we didn't want to do that. And we tried really hard to do something different. And I do think what we did was different than what many people do. But if we had another 4 years to start over again, we would, of course, have all of this knowledge and expertise to help us do it differently. And we likely would do something different next time around.
And if I could just add, Melissa mentioned that at the beginning that the pressing, never-ending need is for reviewers. And so one way to completely change the board when you look and say 95% of them are Euro-Americans is to say, let's just start from scratch, right? Let's just get rid of everyone and start from scratch. And we want a much more representative board. But then who's going to do your reviewing, right? You still need to keep some people who have expertise in those sort of various areas that CCC says it's seeking submissions for. And you need people who are available. Sometimes we identified, say, 5 to 10 people who were in the Global South in the areas of critical media studies, but they weren't available. They were already overcommitted. Melissa had a lot of people who were like, I'm already on 4 other editorial boards. I can't add another one. Or everyone always comes to me for getting scholarship in East Asia. I just can't do more. So it's also this kind of balance between what we would like and what people's availability is.
That makes sense. Does any journal exist that holds open calls or elections to its board? Or was that a critique which you came upon reflection independently of any examples existing in the world?
One of our reviewers asked us this for an earlier draft, and we said, we've never seen announcements in our fields, right? Communication, media studies, cultural studies, gender studies. Never seen an announcement saying, hey, nominate yourself to be on the editorial board. And no, I think it's always this sort of tapping on the shoulder or people coming up with lists and then having some kind of consensus, right? I don't know, Melissa. I think we just couldn't think of any other examples.
No, I mean, I can think of no examples. I would like to think there is someone out there who does it that way. And I hope that people will read the article and consider, even if you elected half the board as a starting point, it would move the needle, I think. Again, it seems very obvious when we, put it out there, but it didn't feel that way to us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You made such a dedicated effort. One reason the article, you really went out of your way to try to not replicate past errors and cast an extremely wide net, not just through your immediate network, but through a hugely extended network. Even still, seeking so hard to remedy the imbalance. It's not my intention to be condemnatory, but just to say, as you write in the article, you only decreased Global North editorial board representation. And I don't mean to phrase it that way, but obviously, 1 minus Global North representation is Global South representation. So you managed to decrease Global North representation from 95.6% on the editorial board to 82.4%. So there was significant measurable movement, but given the absolute level, the base level from where you were starting, the quantum relative to the size of the task maybe wasn't really there. Apart from the points you've mentioned so far, based on your experience, why do you think you were unable to make more significant progress?
Well, I think Eve already nodded to some of those reasons. We reached out to scholars that, came onto our radar from inquiry amongst ourselves and with other editorial board members. And those folks tend to be the visible folks of the Global South, and everyone's knocking on their door. I'll just remind you again, it was also during COVID. One of our goals was really to improve the transparency and equity in the policies of the journal. And it wasn't even clear to me how people got on or off the board before we arrived. And so as we were adding people to the board, we would try and be clear. And we did this with folks who were already on the board, that we had an expectation that every member of the board would be open to reviewing 2 articles a year, which I think is fairly minimal. But some folks didn't want to do that, or they didn't have time to. And so it wasn't just, hey, do you want your name on the masthead of the journal? I don't know who would say no to that, because also in academia, we know that being on a board is prestigious. And when you go up for promotion or tenure, that's helpful. But we didn't just say, would you like to be on the editorial board? We said, and we will have an expectation that you review 2 articles a year. And so a lot of people with marginalized identities, including being from the Global South, would say, I am already doing everything I can do, and I just don't have the time to do this. And that makes good sense. We know from scholarship and from the people around us who are often overburdened as folks with marginalized identities do extra mentorship with students. They're called on to represent their marginalized status in so many different ways in academia. And so it makes sense that some folks just wouldn't feel like they had the time to do that. I also think a bigger way to think about this whole situation is, of course, we're one journal set in one organization in the larger structure of the world. And all of the biases and inequities that exist in the world, of course, influence the work that we did. And we tried to acknowledge them, talk about them, be upfront about them as much as possible. But all of the processes in the journal were subject to the same kinds of, biases and impact of, international policy that, we see on a broader scale. So we did everything we felt we could with what we knew at the time to move that needle. And I appreciate you saying you weren't trying to minimize what we did. We do feel like what we did was big compared to other journals. And if you look at other journals' mastheads, I think you'll see it is different. But also as a new editor, I was always operating with the like, well, what are we allowed to do? You know, what is okay to do? I didn't want to get kicked out of my 4 years. And so we got bolder as the years went on. But there is a lot of learning to do that, you know, at least in my case, nobody sat me down to work with me on it. And so we were feeling around in the dark in a lot of ways.
And I would just say one really important thing that no one informed Melissa, or I think just in general, is how do you get people off a board? Because if you just keep adding people, then it just becomes like there are hundreds, right? So generally to add people to the board, you have to kick people off, right? But there's no one says, how do you, email a senior scholar who's been on the board for like 10 years but hasn't reviewed anything for the last 8 years? How do you get them off? So that's another related issue.
Yeah. I made some people mad.
Yeah.
By thanking them for their service and saying their term was over.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to do because nobody wants to create enemies. In general, I appreciate that you highlighted that because I did notice in the metrics in the article where you show how you increase the diversity of the board, you're telling us now that you did unfortunately have to make some people angry. It seems like it was difficult for you to remove people because one of your ways of increasing diversity on the board primarily seems to have been adding new people and increasing the total size of the board.
I mean, we did both. We identified every year who we thought it was time to thank and have them leave. But also we did make the board bigger. That's true.
Apart from editorial boards, on the problem of underrepresentation of scholars from the Global South in authorship in major English language international journals, you highlight the role of special issues. How successful and unsuccessful have special issues been as a remedy for academic underrepresentation in authorship?
This is, I think, one of the central questions that we addressed in the paper, but it reflects one of the strategies that we took over the 4 years. So the logic about special issues is that if just by open course submissions, we're not getting the proportion of either papers from Global South scholars or papers focused on contexts in the Global South, then a special issue that focuses specifically on the Global South is one way to not just get, a single paper, but like a bunch of papers, right? And we had a process where scholars can submit proposals for special issues, and then the editorial board would review the submissions, the special issue proposal. I want to say one thing about our special issues, because the term special issue might imply that it's somehow sort of siloed away from like regular issues and it just happens like once every so often. But actually, when we looked at the number of special issues we had, so every year CCC publishes 4 issues, and over the course of the 4 years, we had 10 issues that count as special issues, either because the regular papers, the full-length papers were a special issue, or we had a section called the forum, which consists of shorter essays. Across all of those 4 years, we had 10 special issues. Some of them had just regular papers. Some of them just had forum, a special issue forum, and some had both. And then when we looked at, of these special issues, looking at the sort of how much they took up in terms of pages, it was less than half, but it was close to half. So our count, I think, in the paper we say it consisted of like over 40% of the pages were special issue papers. So they weren't in that sense like tokenized, right? They were an integral part of our journal. So there's the pages thing. And then if we think about the other sort of dimensions, there's what is the topic? Where are the authors submitting from? But then who are the authors in terms of origin? And there we were lucky enough to have data for both the citizenship of the submitting author, if it was multiple authors, and the location where they were submitting from. So we could analyze that data for all of the issues, not just the special issues. And we found significant differences in all of those 3 things, like the topics, the location of the authors, and the citizenship of the authors between special issues and regular issues. So The things that I think, if you look at our data, the special issues did work were topics. So of the 10 special issues, 5 of them were specifically focused on the Global South. And then I think we mentioned 2 others weren't specifically about the Global South, but had global themes. And so at least some of the papers were in Global South contexts. And that was a significantly higher proportion sort of topics-wise compared to the regular issues. But if you look at authorship, which you mentioned earlier, yes, one thing that really struck us were there were issues about the Global South in terms of topic, which had either no authors located in, submitting from a Global South country, or maybe just one. It was something like 6, right? 6 of those issues, there was 0 or 1 author submitting from a Global South country. But if we look at citizenship, like where were they born? What is their current citizenship? Then it was a better picture. It was still typically not a majority of all of the special issues, but for some issues, for certain issues, the majority of the authors had Global South citizenship. For others, it was, something like 3 out of 8, which is, pretty good compared to other issues. And when we compared it to the regular issues, those numbers were also higher. The other piece which we started to look at when we compared our data to a paper by Ekdale et al. In looking at journalism studies was to look at citations, because they had found that if you look 5 years after the publication of special issues, citations for special issue papers are lower than citations for regular issues. And if we're saying, hey, here's a chance for Global South scholarship and Global South authors to be represented, but then later on the citations are lower, then that's a problem. But our data was too new. We wrote this paper in 2024, and then even if we look back to the first year, it's only like 3 years. We had some suggestive data, but we're not really sure about our citation numbers yet.
There's one more thing I'd like to add about the special issues. They were an intentional strategy of the editorial team. When you look at sort of the patterns of who regularly publishes where, the issues before we took over largely published Global North scholars. And we knew that we couldn't just all of a sudden say like, hey, open for business, Global South scholars, come publish here. So we knew that special issues might be a way to find one contact and say, hey, would you like to do something? And what would the topic be? And can you bring scholars into the journal? And then the hope was that years down the line, it would be clear that the journal was open to publishing work by Global South scholars. But we knew in 4 years we wouldn't be able to make that big of a signal change that it would automatically draw submissions where there maybe hadn't been before.
That makes a lot of sense. It was difficult to read your article and avoid the question of merit, which just seemed to come up over again. You cite voices who were against your diversity objectives as arguing for merit, including specifically one Martin Medhurst, who is a senior white male scholar who in 2019 opposed the National Communication Association's decision to have a separate awards committee choose nominees for their Distinguished Scholar Awards, because he said identity would be, quote, prioritized over intellectual and scholarly merit, end quote. At the same time, your pre-submission review program, quote, has not resulted in as many submissions from the Global South as it was intended to. We received only one such submission from a Tier B country, and it did not make it to publication, despite detailed mentoring feedback, end quote. You also write that in 2023, quote, of 74 submissions to CCC from Global South countries, only one from China was accepted, 1.4%, end quote. US-based scholars had a 41% acceptance rate, UK-based scholars 30, and other Global North-based scholars 19. Your desk rejected articles from Global South authors, meaning rejected before sending them out for peer review, because of a lack of focus on critical communication media studies scholarship, limited analytical scope, quantitative methodology without any critically oriented analysis, or wildly exceeding the maximum word count, was far in excess of desperate rejections for Global North submissions. Global North submissions were rejected, and for the same reasons, but at a much lower rate. A provocative question. Forgive me for framing it this way, but I mean, are Global North academics simply better?
Well, I hope you'll know at this point in the conversation, our answer is no. No, they're not better. As we said earlier, one of our goals was to improve transparency and equity in the editorial policies of the journal. And I think this is key to understanding this, is that, again, the journal's set in this larger schema of academia. The journal, because it originates from a particular kind of association and is published by a Global North publisher, there are particular expectations that the journal has. And we would argue that Global North scholars are better mentored to meet those expectations than scholars in the Global South who may operate under different expectations or have limited mentorship, which is one of the reasons why we developed the pre-submission review program. And when we did so, we talked with 2 other journals outside of our discipline who had similar programs. And they said, we just want to caution you, you're not going to get very many submissions. This takes a long time to build a program like this. And so we talked about it and decided, well, maybe we won't see the impact of the change in our editorial term, but hopefully if the next editor teams will keep the program, it will build. We revised the journal scope. We revised the about section of the journal on our website. We went very carefully over the instructions for authors to make them transparent, clear, to make this maybe steps that hadn't been visible before visible to authors. And I'll go back to the idea of special issues as well. It's not like all of a sudden, green light, everybody, come here. We're going to help you figure it out. It takes time to build those processes. And we know that academia scholars, grad students and faculty alike are hungry for publications because that's how we're told we achieve and, are tenured in our fields. And so we received a lot of submissions that seem like they were from people who were just trying to get their submission somewhere. We don't take those kinds of submissions. We tried to make that much clearer from our website, but we can't control whether authors read the website before they submit. So I don't think there's no argument in which I would ever conclude Global North scholars are better than Global South scholars. I think they're mentored differently. And not all scholars stop to read all the instructions for authors to make sure they're a good fit before they submit. And we just saw greater misalignment with Global South scholars than we did with Global North. And for us, we saw that as a mentorship issue. And that's why, again, it's a small program, but we did create a program to try and provide mentorship to scholars. And we also went and promoted it at our organization. Every time we had an annual conference, we would go to different interest groups and share information about the program. But it takes time for something like that to build.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction between alignment and merit. Yeah, it's not just a euphemism. It's a separate thing, and they shouldn't be confused. That's a really useful answer. Really early in your article, you bring up this question of ideological hegemony. You cite some research that communications and media studies journals favor Global North content and especially suffer from U.S. centrism, with articles about Anglophone Global North countries overwhelmingly dominating. I wonder, in our increasingly well-traveled and cosmopolitan world, how appropriate is the goal of increasing authorship from Global South citizens and authors located in the global south. You know, as a Palestinian, I think a lot about the fight for justice in Palestine as a reference example that I know well. And there, the battle lines really aren't clear at all. So many young Jewish Americans are increasingly allied with Palestinians in their anti-Zionism. And in Palestine itself, you have the Palestinian Druze who have Israeli citizenship, serving in the Israeli military, committing genocide in Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority works with Israel to crush any signs of protest in the West Bank. This is just one example. It's just one that I personally happen to know well. One can think of so many others. Even in the West, leaders from historically disadvantaged groups almost always come to power with an agenda to reinforce, not challenge the status quo. Thatcher, Obama, Rishi Sunak, whomever. Anyway, I don't want to go on about it, just to say that that is all just to argue that identity and perspective are very clearly distinct things. And so if the best universities in the world just happen to be in the United States, and so inevitably many of the best academics in the world will end up there. I mean, you already saw some increase, Professor, you referenced this earlier, when you compare academics located in the global south versus academics who have global south citizenship, not necessarily located in the global south. But I wonder if one stretched that further to think about if it would be worthwhile to consider measuring representation and citations, so on and so forth, for global people who hold global south perspectives, as opposed to global south citizenship. I don't know if that's a useful line of reasoning.
No, I think that's a great question. And to some extent, I think we didn't address it explicitly in those terms in the section on the special issues, but we did make that distinction saying when looking at topics, right, are these papers about the global south, and implicit often is taking a global south positionality versus where are the authors submitting from. And I have no argument with your general point that a lot of the best work in our field and in many fields is being done at universities in the US. That's clear. And if we extend that to particular forms of progressive political activism, we also see a great deal of activity there too. But I would point to another part of our article to ask, why is it? I mean, you said it's no surprise that then so many scholars end up at quote unquote the best universities that happen to be in the US. But why is it that they end up here? It's not just that they were always just, the best shining examples of, critical media studies and therefore everyone should come here. It's this kind of cyclical and self-perpetuating thing, right? So if it starts off with a minor imbalance such that a 60-40 kind of thing, like 60% of scholars from the global south end up in the global north and only 40% stay, it will just get worse and worse. And that really is what we have seen. So we cited a paper by Demeter in the International Journal of Communication, and others have talked about this too, but they were looking specifically at our field, looking at what they called academic migration, the problem of academic capital. So many scholars either come to the US or some other Euro-Anglo country or Australia for grad school and then don't go home. I think a smaller proportion do their graduate, PhD degrees in their home countries and might work in their home countries for a time, but then end up in the global north. And we saw that actually during our own sort of editorial team. One of the associate editors moved from a global south country to a global north country. I was going to point out earlier the sort of wealth of Latin American communication and media studies scholarship and point to the fact that 2 out of the 4 co-editors for the special issue of OMGC were located in Brazil. But one of them, Jamil Marquez, has since, I just Googled him and saw that he's now at the University of Iowa. So, it's this kind of process where people who are doing critical scholarship, critical media studies or more critical cultural studies and other fields too, right, find more prestige being associated with a Global North institution And just, it's not even like employment, right? It's the whole thing. It's the grad school, it's the sort of scholarships. Melissa already highlighted the fact that we as CCC, we're just a very small node in this huge imbalance in academia and beyond academia. So I would ask us to look at that problem rather than seeing it in terms of, well, it's already, the university is already great here and there are already so many people looking at the world from a global south lens. So what's the problem? I think quickly the problem is what we started with, which is A, a question of equity, but also B, there is actually lots of critical scholarship being done elsewhere that could grow into nodes themselves, if not for this seemingly something that is really hard to get out of.
I was wondering about the position and profile of your journal in its fields. Is this a particularly prestigious or highly visible journal? And if so, what kind of visibility, impact, or debate did the publishing of your article produce within the fields, within your peers?
First, I'd like to say that even though I'm in critical media studies and therefore am in a bubble, I do recognize that within communication and media studies, critical scholarship is actually a minority and it's often marginalized. So if you look at flagship journals like the Journal of Communication or Communication Theory, they're much more quantitatively oriented, despite every time they have a new editorial team, they're like, we're going to make it more inclusive, but well, change is slow. And I don't doubt that often those editorial teams do have good intentions. If an organization like ICA has multiple journals, there'll be like one or maybe two journals dedicated to critical media studies, more qualitative approaches, and then like 6 or 7 that are like mainstream. So for example, NCA, the National Communication Association, has critical studies in media communication, and they have the other one, critical cultural communication studies, CCCS. So they actually have 2, but we only have this one. So within ICA, we are the most prominent critical media studies journal that they publish. But within the whole field, the other journals have, higher citations, etc. I think we are a first quartile journal by some metrics, but we're not like, the top 10. And so that is also, a part of the sort of inequities of the field.
Yeah, I've been trying to Google all the quantitative numbers that demonstrate whether the journal's well-known or not. And I wasn't able to find the ranking in the field that I was hoping for. But for instance, our 2-year impact factor is a 2.0. Our 5-year is a 1.659. Compared to a lot of the journals that Eve mentioned, we're lower down. And I think that has something to do with the prominence of critical scholarship in the field, not so much to do with the quality of the journal. I don't know what kind of impact our article will have at all. It hasn't been out very long, so I don't know. But I do intend to send it to the person that I reported to as editor in ICA to see if he would like to read it or talk about it. I don't know what kind of an impact it will have in our field, but I do hope it's read by people outside the field too, because I think it has a lot to offer.
We really feel like we've never seen an article about academic publishing written by the editorial team saying, this is what we did in terms of, the issues that we wanted to address. And this is where it worked. And mostly though, this is where it did not work. And this is what more needs to be done. It's not something I think that people tend to talk about because, as Melissa said, it's all sort of hidden.
Yeah, I think it's so important, especially now in our current day and age with social media. I mean, the kind of content that we're all really thirsting for is that content that peels back the curtain, and that kind of transparency really helps us all collectively move forward. Is there any sign that the existing leadership, they are seeking to continue your efforts?
Yes, that was one of the conversations I had with Paula as she came on, specifically about the pre-mentoring program. but just in general about the desperate need to sort of refocus what is published in CCC. And I think, I mean, this is something I think you should probably talk to, Paula Chakravarty about, but I think one of the other ways to change the scope of the journal is to think about the culture piece in a different way. So part of the misalignment, by the way, I think that Melissa had to deal with as editor-in-chief is the name of the journal, Communication, Culture, and Critique. That culture piece meant that people would be like, oh, a religious studies? Sure, I'll submit it because it's about culture and communication is just people talking, right? Or we would get submissions that were basically linguistics or sociolinguistics. But I think, another piece of the culture is how much do we explicitly look for political submissions or proposals for special issues from particular sort of political perspectives? Because again, politics is part of culture, right? So there are different ways to think about the scope.
Yeah, I mean, Eve and I have both met with the new editor, and I think she's fantastic. I think she'll go about the same goals in different ways, which is, of course, an editor's prerogative. But the first issue just came out last month. And just to give you a sense of the editorial collective, the first thing that they published was a statement on the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which was a topic that we were really interested in also, but you do the issues so far in advance that we didn't have space to do something on that topic. I think she'll lean in to her identity as a critical scholar in different ways than we did, but I think it will continue the work, what we did together.
That's good news. I was reflecting on your response on the question of the critique of lack of merit when diversity is or inclusion is promoted. And I was also listening to how inherently, without question, you firmly held the line on your requirements. And I wonder if it's your opinion or your view or your sense that critics like Medhurst are aware of your merit-based criteria. Do you believe that they disingenuously make that argument, or that there's some sort of miscommunication happening and they genuinely are confused and erroneously believe that merit will be sacrificed to make space for others?
Gosh, I really wish I knew the answer to that question, because I think it would dismantle a lot of things right now. A lot of folks seem to be making that argument, for instance, in the U.S. government right now. I only have a gut answer to that because I don't know Martin Medhurst and I don't know what he thinks. But it feels to me like that answer is an affective one. They're responding about how it feels to have people want to change the rules from how they've always been, all of the things that already benefited largely white male scholars. When folks are asking for the rules to change, I feel like that's an easy way to dismiss the argument. Communication scholars, many of us teach classes on argumentation, and I don't think that's the strongest argument. I don't think it's rooted in evidence personally, but it does feel to me like it's a reaction based in one's emotions, not so much in one's intellect.
And I think there's also this kind of like zero-sum mentality, right? Which is that if we make space for these other people, somehow those that already benefited will be pushed out or pushed down. And to some extent, I mean, yes, like if you're a journal and you publish a special issue on topic X, that does mean that that particular issue isn't on topic A, B, and C that you always published about. But my response to that is sort of my response when I'm making argumentation about media representation, about queer media representation, which is, sure, like if, one of the 6 characters is now queer and now you have to like watch like a queer romance on this show, you have like 100 other shows that you can go and watch, right? Like if you have like a lesbian couple on ER like a million years ago and you want to see a straight couple in a medical show, go watch the 20 other shows that are like this, right? So I would make the same argument. It's like our journal, which is just one of like hundreds of communication and media studies journals. And again, it's not even the flagship one, right? If we make space to publish on particular topics, and we do not, as you said, we do not sacrifice merit. In fact, the special issues, if you look at there are many, many sort of just wildly excellent articles in those special issues, then what's the problem, right? If the problem is that you perceive that it's you, meaning less sort of traditionally privileged scholars, perceive that this is a threat or an attack on merit, I agree with Melissa. It's based more on sort of an anxiety than the actual facts of the matter.
So where does that leave us? What more can be done? What can your colleagues and peers on a forward basis learn from your experience and implement and change? What new experiments should we be attempting?
Well, I think we should be doing so many things. I think we could think about two main domains for change, one in specific journals and a second in professional organizations like ICA, or even at the publisher level. There are, of course, power dynamics between scholars and journals. As we talked about before, authors want to be published. They need to be published to move up in the field. So authors can't really push against a journal in the way that we might hope that they could and ask for change. So journal editors and editorial boards and professional organizations and publishers should be working to make things more transparent and should be implementing these policies on their own. So talking specifically about journals, one of the reasons that we put this article together was we feel like the work of journal editors shouldn't be hidden, and it usually is. And we should hold journal editors to a higher standard than what the current one is. People should be asking questions about how we get onto editorial boards. That should be transparent to members. So editors, in my opinion, should be working to increase transparency. And I mean, there were many times when Eve and I were writing this paper where, we would get together to meet about a section and I would be like, oh my gosh, I really thought we were making things better. And this is such a small change that we made. And it was painful to write some of it. But, as critical scholars, we were committed to making our work transparent, even if it meant, we went down the wrong, path and it didn't work or the change wasn't very big. We still felt like sharing what we did with others might help other people to start at a better starting point than we did in our 4-year term. And I also think if we think about publishers and associations, there should be conversations in those spaces about how to make journals work better for authors and how to make things more equitable for everyone who participates in the work of journals. So organizations should be holding editors to the standard of transparency. The other thing that, we didn't have time to write about, nor did we actually learn much about, is the economics of academic publishing, especially as they help to fund associations. It may be, and I'm not saying this is the case for ICA because I really don't know, but the amount of money that an organization can earn from hosting a journal would make the organization very hesitant to make any big changes that might impact that income flow. So organizations should be transparent too about, their relationships with publishers, how many, issues come out a year and what that means for how much they're earning. There's just so much more in this area that I think we should be focused on. And I hope that the piece that we wrote together will be a small part of encouraging people to ask the kinds of questions that we asked in the piece.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Transparency is such a commendable thing. Self-critique is also commendable, but transparent self-critique is so much more commendable than either of those things in isolation. You took a lot of risk in publishing this article and in participating in this conversation. It takes a lot of bravery and vulnerability. And I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to share this with our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
That was Drs. Eve Ng and Melissa Click, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you'd like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on democratizing academic publishing that you would like us to explore, please write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com. We'd love to hear from you. And if enough of you write to us about democratizing academic publishing or any other topic related to sustainability and scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in a future episode. Thank you as always for being with us. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.